The story begins inside the royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly wakes up in a large bed. As he raises his hands before his face, he feels confused and restless, wondering why they look so small and weak. It is then that the truth slowly sinks in. He has been reincarnated from his former miserable life. In his previous world, Van led a monotonous and empty existence. Working a dead-end job with a salary that barely covered his rent and bills, every day felt the same, filled with stress, boredom, and regret. However, for some reason, the universe decided to grant him a second chance, bringing him to another world to be reborn as the young lord of a remote village. Van carefully climbs out of bed and steps onto a small wooden stool to look out the window. Tall buildings, vast lands, and peaceful skies stretch out before him. But before he can enjoy the view for long, his maid Tillil tells him to get down immediately, fearing for his safety. At this point, Van is only 2 years old, so Tillil is struck with surprise when he responds calmly using clear and sophisticated language. Hearing his own voice, Van suddenly realizes he also possesses memories of the time he has already spent in this world. These memories merge with those of his past life in Japan, confirming that he has indeed been reincarnated. About an hour later, Van sits down for breakfast with his father and siblings. The room is silent, filled with a palpable awkwardness. After several long minutes, Van's father, Galpa, breaks the silence by asking his second son, Yar, about his studies for the day. Yar responds that he will be studying fire magic and battle formations. Jalpa then asks his third son, Suo, who replies that he will also be studying magic. Finally, Jalpa turns to Van. The boy answers honestly, stating that since there is still much he doesn't understand, he wants to start by learning about the country's history and culture. Van's brothers shudder in disbelief. They cannot comprehend how their 2-year-old brother sounds so much more intelligent than them. Suddenly, his father bursts into laughter, admitting he is impressed by Van's potential at such a young age. He shares his high hopes that Van will inherit a strong talent for fire magic, just as he and Van's mother did. Jalpa explains that the magic aptitude test will take place when Van turns 8 and warns him not to disappoint. In this world, magical aptitude is everything. Magic is primarily divided into 4 elements: fire, water, wind, and earth, while other types of magic exist. Anything outside these 4 is heavily looked down upon. After breakfast, Van heads to his study, where the maids give him a simple explanation of how society works. Just as they finish, the head butler, Espada, enters the room and drops a large stack of books on Van's desk. Espada is an exceptionally skilled butler who has served Van's father for years. Nonetheless, Van still finds him quite intimidating. Espada mentions he is aware that Van has started learning to read and do simple math, and asks how far he has progressed. Our protagonist honestly admits he cannot yet read fluently and only knows how to add and subtract. Knowing Van is capable of much more, Espada decides to personally take charge of his education as his tutor. Sword's lessons quickly turn into a living nightmare for Van. The training is strict, long, and exhausting, leaving no room for excuses or rest. However, thanks to these harsh lessons, Van learns to read and write in just a few weeks. After 2 full years of uninterrupted study, Van finally turns 4 and begins his sword training. At first, he is absolutely terrible. He loses again and again, even against the maid during practice sessions. Despite this, Van continues to train every single day. By the time he turns 5, his efforts finally bear fruit. He begins sparring with older boys preparing to become soldiers and is able to face them on equal footing. Van notices that their movements are simple and easy to predict, defeating them repeatedly without much trouble. The other children are completely shocked by his performance and begin to believe he might be some kind of chosen one. Furthermore, many of the children grow fond of Van because, unlike his brothers, he actually talks to them and builds real friendships. Not long after, our protagonist decides to take a short break to drink some water. At that moment, the vice commander of the Knights, Dio, enters and politely asks Van to show him his hands. Dio examines them carefully and is shocked to see that Van has no calluses or bruises, suggesting he hasn't been training with the sword for long. Van admits this is true and explains he has been busy studying. Dio mentions that Espada has been making him study almost triple the normal amount. He states he is willing to speak with Espada to reduce Van's study time and increase his training. As life isn't just about books, Dio then vows that if Van gets more time to train, he will turn him into the greatest swordsman of all time. Van responds that it won't be necessary to speak with Espada, as he believes he can handle both. Dio agrees, but suggests that he become Van's personal instructor to ensure he follows the right path. Training with Dio quickly becomes another living nightmare. He subjects Van to extremely intense exercises with almost no time to rest. Even so, Van notes that despite how hard everything has been, every day since his reincarnation has been pleasant. For the first time, he feels a sense of fulfillment that he never had in his past life. With this realization, Van decides to enjoy a fun and meaningful life in this new world. A year later, Van turns 6. By this point, the endless routine of studying and training starts to feel monotonous. He realizes that if things continue this way, he will never live the fun life he promised himself. From that moment on, he decides to start acting like a normal child and spend time having fun. One day, he tells the maid he wants to go out and play, so she takes him to the market. Our protagonist is marveled by the variety of people, sounds, and goods being sold. While walking, Van is distracted by a huge building known as the Merry Commerce Company. As he watches in awe, a disturbing scene unfolds nearby. A child in shackles and chains is being dragged through the market. Van immediately asks why the boy is chained. The man coldly responds that he is selling his son as a slave, claiming that since the boy belongs to him, he can do whatever he wants. The maid explains to Van that it is common for poor families to sell children they cannot support. Van admits it is cruel to watch, but feels there is little he can do. At that moment, a woman named Rosalie approaches and greets Van. He asks her how much the man would receive for his son. Rosalie explains that the price depends on magical aptitude. After learning the boy has a thief, aptitude which is considered very Ryoushu, says he wouldn't sell for more than 3 silver coins. Hearing this, the man becomes enraged and begins to kick his son repeatedly, shouting that he is useless. Suddenly, our protagonist steps forward and stops the man, announcing he will buy the boy for 5 silver coins. The man accepts immediately and leaves without looking back. Van kneels before the boy, who introduces himself as Kamshin. Van tells Kamshin he is free to go wherever he wants. He only bought him to set him free. However, when Van learns that Kamshin has nowhere to go, he suggests they live together. One of the guards warns Van that the Marquis might not approve of bringing home a stranger, but if the boy is registered as Van's slave, there should be no problem. Van asks Kamshin if he is okay with this, and Kamshin agrees. From that moment, Kamshin officially becomes Van's slave. Rosalie then informs them that to make it final, they must complete the slavery contract. Both Van and Kamshin extend their hands at the same time, following Rosalie's instructions. As the slavery contract is formed, a glowing mark appears on the back of Kamshin's hand. This mark is proof of the contract and will not disappear as long as it remains active. Once everything is finished, Van and Kamshin enter the commerce company together. So Kamshin can get a set of clean clothes and stop looking like a shackled street slave. A few days later, back at the palace, Van is finally about to enjoy a rare moment of peace. Just as he reaches for a cookie and is about to take a bite, Kamshin enters the room and informs him that Dio has arrived for training. Van freezes completely. Without a second thought, he hands the cookie to Kamshin and tells him to go tell Dio that he isn't there. Van knows all too well that there is no way he would survive such a brutal training session. Kamshin does as ordered, but Dio is clearly disappointed. However, since he still wants to train someone, he decides to take Kamshin instead and begins training him in Van's place. 2 more years pass, and Van finally turns 8. This means the time has come for his magical aptitude to be officially evaluated. The upcoming test becomes the talk of the town. Nobles, servants, soldiers, and even merchants are anxious to see the results. Many believe Van will show great talent, especially since both his parents were gifted in fire magic. Even his father Jalpa is convinced that Van will at least possess an affinity for fire. However, on the day of the test, everyone is stunned. To their surprise, Van has no aptitude for fire, water, wind, or earth. Instead, he only possesses production magic, which is widely considered the worst and most useless type of magic in the world. The atmosphere turns cold instantly. Jalpa is enraged, realizing that, in his eyes, his son is a complete failure. In a fit of rage, he draws his sword, prepared to kill Van on the spot. Our protagonist is paralyzed by fear, unable to move or speak. Just as his father is about to strike the eldest son, Mirzus steps in front of Van to stop him. Mirzus proposes an alternative solution. He suggests that Van be put in charge of a remote village within their territory. Mirzus explains that the village is too isolated to develop properly, and since it was recently acquired, many of the residents are not loyal to the family. Placing one of their own as lord would help secure the villagers' loyalty. Jalpa pauses to consider the idea and realizes it is a reasonable solution. He sheaths his sword and declares that Van will become the lord of those lands. Then, Jalpa coldly tells Van to pack his belongings and leave as soon as possible, stating there is no room for someone useless in his house. After their father leaves, Mirzus bows deeply and apologizes to Van for such a humiliating outcome. Van tells him there is no need to apologize because, without Mirzus' intervention, he would be dead. The next day, Van packs his things, feeling a strange sense of excitement. He believes there won't be much work there, and that, for the first time, he might finally live the fun and relaxed life he's always wanted. Everything seems to be going smoothly until Dio and Espada announce they will accompany him to oversee his training and studies. Our protagonist lets out a long sigh of frustration, knowing they will likely turn his life into a hell again. To make matters worse or better, his favorite maid also decides to go with him, saying she cannot bear to be apart. With the preparations complete, Van boards the carriage and begins his journey toward a new life. After traveling through the forest for a while, Van decides to kill time by testing his production magic. After concentrating for a moment, he successfully produces a tiny sword in the palm of his hand. Kamshin watches this happen but isn't truly surprised by the result, as he already knows that Van has a natural aptitude for production magic and learns these things quickly. Moving that aside, given that Van has been banished from his home and stripped of his former status, he brings up something that has been troubling him for a while. He tells Kamshin that there is no longer any need for him to continue working as his slave. Van explains that if Kamshin doesn't enjoy traveling with him, or no longer feels comfortable staying by his side, he could simply release him from his slavery contract and send him on his way to live in freedom. Kamshin rejects the offer immediately and without hesitation. He firmly reminds Van that he has already dedicated his life to him and that the decision was not made lightly. Kamshin goes on to say that he would be more than willing to give his life if it meant ensuring Van's safety, regardless of the situation they find themselves in. Hearing this, Van accepts Kamshin's determination, even if it makes him feel a bit awkward suddenly. The carriage comes to an abrupt halt, jarring everyone inside. When Van looks out to see what is happening, he notices that the village ahead is being attacked. The knights guarding Van quickly assume the attackers are bandits, or perhaps a mercenary group looking for easy loot. Dio carefully examines the enemy formation and counts their numbers. Realizing there are approximately 50 attackers in total, based on this, he calculates that if they join forces and charge together, they could likely wipe out the attackers without much trouble. From a purely tactical standpoint, the numbers seem manageable. However, one of the adventurers traveling with them, a man named Ortho, disagrees with this approach. Ortho reminds Dio that their job was very clear from the start. They were hired only to protect and defend Van in case he himself was in danger. Since Van is currently unharmed and they are not being attacked directly, he argues there is no reason for them to risk their lives in a battle that isn't part of their contract. Dio is visibly frustrated but declares he is going to fight anyway. He says he cannot stand by while innocent villagers are being slaughtered right before his eyes. Even if no one else joins him, he is willing to charge alone. Before leaving, he asks the adventurers to at least stay back and focus on protecting Van should the situation worsen. Before Dio can move, Espada suddenly speaks up and dismisses the idea. Espada bluntly tells Dio that wasting his life like that would be incredibly stupid, especially considering his importance. He explains that Dio's death would severely damage the future of the kingdom's military forces. As a well-known and highly respected elemental mage, Espada proposes a more calculated plan instead. He suggests raising a powerful defensive barrier around their position to keep Van safe. while the adventurers launch long-distance attacks from behind the barrier to thin out the enemy forces safely. Once the enemy's attention is fully focused on them, Dio and the other knights would surprise the attackers by launching a sudden assault from the right. Flank. Espada is fairly certain this strategy would guarantee victory if executed correctly. However, Van quickly realizes what this plan truly means for the enemy to focus on a single point. Espada himself would have to stay behind and deliberately act as bait. Espada confirms Van's concern without hesitation, explaining that this is the only way the plan could work. If he doesn't serve as a decoy, then Dio and his men would be forced into a direct confrontation and would most likely die in vain. Upon hearing this, Van immediately understands the weight of those words. If something went wrong, it would mean Espada sacrificing his life. Our protagonist realizes that losing both the kingdom's greatest strategist and its most powerful warrior would be an irreversible blow. Without them, there would be no way to properly develop or protect this land in the future. That is why Van steps forward and offers to act as the bait himself. Till dismisses the idea immediately, saying she would rather be the decoy herself than allow Van to put his life at risk. Kamshin completely agrees with her, standing firm by Van's side. Still, Van calmly tells them both that he appreciates them deeply, and that is precisely why he cannot allow either of them to be in danger. Van then explains his own plan. He will go out in the carriage and attack the enemy head-on to draw their attention, while the rest attack from long range and from both flanks simultaneously. As he moves away, Van reminds everyone that he spent years undergoing intensive sword training, so there is no way he will fall that easily. Deep down, Van also admits to himself that if he were to die there, he would be at peace with it, as long as it was for a noble cause. Ortho looks at Van with total disbelief after hearing this. Van's words make Ortho recall the time he was still at the guild. Back when he first received the request to protect Van, at that time, he completely hated the idea of protecting a noble, believing they were all rotten. Still, he accepted the mission since he planned to operate in the Furcio territory soon anyway. But in that memory, Van appeared before him, gave a deep bow, and sincerely expressed his gratitude for accepting the task of protecting him. Van continued to praise Ortho with genuine compliments. In that moment, Ortho found himself blushing, realizing for the first time that not all nobles were ruthless or corrupt. Back in the present, Ortho steps forward and stands in front of Van, declaring that there is no way they will allow a boy like him to risk his life like that. Dio and Espada also move forward, showing their full agreement with Ortho's stance. With that decided, Espada opts to revise the strategy completely and crafts a new plan on the spot. First, Espada will raise a powerful defensive wall. From behind it, the adventurers will unleash long-range attacks. Then, Dio and his men will charge from the left flank, while Ortho and his group assault the enemy from the right flank at the same time. The plan begins immediately. Espada quickly raises the defensive wall, and once it's in place, the adventurers begin firing arrows from behind it, wiping out the first wave of bandits almost instantly. The bandits are caught completely off guard. As the remaining attackers try to regroup and launch a counterattack, Dio and his men burst through, cutting down another group with their swords. However, amidst the chaos, the bandit leader suddenly breaks through and charges toward the other side of the wall. Just as he is about to attack Pluriel, one of the party members, Van intervenes at the last second. Our protagonist uses his swordsmanship and strikes the bandit directly in the Achilles heel, causing him to drop to his knees, writhing in pain. Immediately after, Kamshin lunges forward to deliver the final blow, ending the threat once and for all. Shortly after, all remaining bandits are tied up, and the threat to the village is neutralized. With the danger gone and the mission officially accomplished, some adventurers decide to head home for other jobs. However, Ortho is deeply impressed by both Van's swordsmanship and his leadership skills during the battle. Curious about Van, he decides to stay longer, offering to help him in any way he can. The members of his group share this feeling and also decide to stay and lend their support. Once everything settles down, Van decides to formally address the village. He steps forward and introduces himself as the new lord to the village chief, a man named Rando. Rando expresses his deep gratitude to Van for saving them, and explains that this isn't the first time such an attack has happened. In fact, The village has been raided several times this year alone. Rando believes they are being targeted because, back when they were part of the Ferdinando County, knights patrolled the area regularly, keeping them safe. Now that those patrols are gone, they have no one to protect them. Van apologizes to Rando and the villagers for their current situation, explaining that the Marquis likely isn't aware of the conditions in remote villages like theirs. Van assures them that now that he is the Lord in charge, he will not ignore their hardships. He suggests 3 concrete measures to protect the village. To 1, produce something so valuable the kingdom cannot afford to ignore. Then 2, raise enough money to hire mercenaries. 3, focus on developing and strengthening the village so it can sustain itself. A young girl from the village speaks up and says they had already thought of those solutions. She adds that while those ideas sound good in theory, they are much easier said than done. Van tries to encourage them, telling the villagers not to worry because he is now their lord and fully intends to protect and develop their lands. Unfortunately, Van's words alone fail to impress the villagers. Seeing this, Espada and Dio step forward to back up Van's claim. They introduce themselves properly, declaring they are the chief commander and the head butler of the kingdom. They assure Rando and the villagers that they truly have nothing to fear. Hearing this, the villagers' morale skyrockets, though they soon raise another concern. They ask about taxes, explaining that it has been extremely difficult to keep paying 30% of their harvest. Van responds by announcing that, for the time being, the tax rate will be reduced to just 10%. He explains that ensuring a stable and livable environment for the villagers is far more important at this moment. The villagers are stunned to hear that. Taxes have been cut to less than half of what they used to be, expressing their deep gratitude toward Van. Immediately after, Espada raises a solid stone wall around the village to protect it from bandits and raiders. He adds that a moat would make their defenses even stronger. And Dio and the other knights tell Van they will take care of that as well. Our protagonist addresses the villagers again, assuring them that as long as they do their best to cooperate with him, he can almost guarantee that this village will be reborn into something much greater than it ever was. Shortly after, Van decides to test his production magic. After concentrating for a while, he creates several wooden blocks. However, these are no ordinary wooden blocks. They are actually made of nanofibers, an incredibly resistant material. The blocks are so durable that when Ortho tries to smash one with his sword, he fails to leave even a single scratch. Van spends the rest of the day using his production magic to create weapons, all of which are of impressive quality. Seeing this, Till begins to wonder if he will run out of mana from using so much magic. Van reassures her, though he recalls hearing that production magic usually consumes an enormous amount of mana, to the point where an average person finds it difficult to create even a single object. He then decides to gift a sword to Kamshin, who is so happy he promises to treasure it forever. Later that night, as he sits by the campfire, Van realizes his body feels extraordinarily sore from camping outdoors. He knows that even though the others are acting fine, they are probably exhausted too. For that reason, Van decides it is time to build a proper house. The next day, Van and his group begin arranging the nanoblocks to build a home. When Rando sees this, he comments that it would be the perfect spot for the Lord's mansion, which makes Van genuinely happy. He then uses his production magic to analyze if it's possible to build a house large enough. He carefully examines every block and every inch of space, and once he finds his rhythm, he activates his magic. Everyone watches in stunned silence as Van creates an entire mansion in the blink of an eye, while the others are completely shocked. Van can't help but think to himself that it ended up being a bit larger than he had originally planned. The villagers celebrate in awe at Van's ability to build such a beautiful mansion in just a few seconds. In that moment, Van realizes that his production magic is much better suited for governing and managing a village than elemental magic. He finds this idea very interesting. He feels people will be more comfortable living under a lord who focuses on creation rather than powerful, offensive magic. Kamshin runs up to him, saying he would much rather live in Van's village than in Lord Joppa's terrible kingdom, though Van takes it with a grain of salt. Knowing Kamshin is clearly biased in his favor, Espada approaches. Vanin explains that what the people of this village truly need is a lord who can improve their daily lives. and that is why he believes Van is the best possible choice for them. Dio and the others agree, still shocked that he was able to create a house out of absolutely nothing. Our protagonist tells them not to worry, as he can build houses for everyone as long as they can bring him enough wood. As soon as they hear this, the adventurers and knights are filled with motivation and turn the task into a competition. Following this, Rondo and the other villagers ask Van if he could also build houses for them. Van looks at their homes and sees they are in very poor condition. Even though he knows he will be extremely tired, he decides to help and promises to build new houses for every single villager. Upon hearing this, the villagers begin to celebrate. Van feels happy because his production magic, which everyone used to look down upon, is now helping him bring smiles to people's faces. Van gets to work immediately, using his magic to repair and rebuild every house until they are all like new. He explains that he made all the houses identical to avoid unfair differences for now, but in the future, he will build homes tailored to each person's needs. The villagers are finally happy to see real change coming to their poor village. They are extremely grateful to Van, and seeing their gratitude makes him feel truly happy inside. Putting that aside for a moment, Van decides to build a simple public bathhouse next to his mansion. The citizens are thrilled and pleased once they see it completed. Although Van originally created the bath for his personal use, he is glad the villagers like it so much and can enjoy it as well. Even though Van built the bath entirely by himself, he received help from both Kamshin and Pluriel while working on it. Later that night, he finally gets some quiet time alone in the bath with Kamshin. After Kamshin steps out, Van notices that he has gained some muscle, which makes Van feel a bit jealous, wishing he had muscles like that too. Kamshin realizes he has indeed buffed up, but admits he is still quite thin compared to Dio. At that moment, Dio and his friends suddenly appear naked and suggest they all bathe together, claiming that men form better bonds when they are undressed. Van immediately takes this as his cue to leave, but Dio grabs him and pulls him back, insisting he stay. After a few long and awkward hours in that strange situation, Van finally goes to his bedroom and lies down on his soft, fluffy bed, feeling calm, relaxed, and satisfied with how things have been going lately. The next day, Van is happy to see that the knights and adventurers worked very hard to dig a deep trench, but there is still no water in it to make it a proper moat. Because of this, Van realizes they need to find or create a water source as quickly as possible. With that in mind, Van comes up with a new plan. Espada will use his magic to divert water from the river, creating a large trench, while Dio and the others continue to expand it by digging manually. Van plans to use his production magic to strengthen and reinforce the trench once it's finished. However, as he watches them work, he begins to feel slightly annoyed, noticing that Dio seems to be enjoying the digging much more than he should. Still, Van is glad to see everyone working together toward a shared goal. He reminds himself that he only needs to finish this task to finally live the peaceful life he has always desired. Van estimates the excavation should take about a week. But when the sun sets, he is shocked by how fast Dio and the others have worked. They have already dug so much that the next village can be seen in the distance. Van suggests they stop for the day, especially since Kamshin and the others look barely alive from exhaustion. Most surprisingly, Dio and Espada still seem to have enough stamina to keep working without rest. By the next day, the canal intended to store and guide the water is completely finished. When the gates are finally opened, everyone watches in awe as the water flows smoothly and steadily through the canal. Not long after, the entire village is successfully surrounded by a water-filled moat. After seeing the result, Van decides it would be smarter to create a lake behind the village, in case heavy rains cause the water level to rise and overflow. Espada agrees, noting that the lake would also be very useful during droughts, making it an important addition for the village's future. Soon after, the lake is finished and the citizens celebrate. Knowing they will never have to worry about getting water again, Van also feels happy, convinced that life in the village will now be much easier for everyone. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, a woman named Panamera is seen traveling toward the remote village along with a noble's daughter named Arte. It is clear they share a strong bond, and Arte seems to trust Panamera completely, seeing her as someone reliable. Back in the village, Van continues to work tirelessly and has just used his production magic to raise a gigantic wall. which everyone finds extremely impressive. Still, Van feels the wall can be made even better and more secure. So he adds long-range ballistic launchers with protective armor. This way, if any intruder attacks, they can defend the village while staying protected. Although Van considers all of this quite basic, everyone else is completely stunned. The villagers begin to realize that their old, dilapidated village is no longer just a villageette, has been transformed into a small fortress capable of defending itself. Dio reflects on this and thinks that if Lord Jalpa had understood Van was capable of such incredible power, he would never have banished him in the first place, and might have even made him an advisor. However, Espada feels Lord Jalpa would have banished him anyway, since his skills are not oriented toward offense or conquering territories. Dio strongly disagrees, arguing that war is not just about offense, but also about solid defenses, and that Van's power could make him the most powerful member of the royal family. They continue to argue about this for quite some time, until Van interrupts them, saying that debating won't do any good, and that all they must do now is fight with all their strength, using what they already have. Everyone agrees with him and focuses on the task at hand. A few hours later, Till prepares a delicious lunch for Van, and as expected, he finds it extremely tasty. During the meal, Espada mentions the concern that they need to find a way to generate income for the village. Our protagonist thinks for a moment and concludes that he can handle the surplus houses and furniture, and that the crops the farmers are planting should be more than enough, so a stronger source of income might not even be necessary. However, Van quickly realizes a downside to this plan. He wouldn't have the necessary ingredients for the baked desserts he loves so much. Therefore, he advises them to start brainstorming ideas for what the village could produce or sell as soon as possible. After weighing several ideas, Van finds none of them promising and realizes that finding something unique and valuable from this village will not be easy. Van suggests that Till and Kamshin test the new weapons he made for them. When Kamshin tests his sword against a shield made of orc material, the sword slices the shield completely in two. Even though Kamshin put barely any effort into the strike, the craftsman immediately bursts into tears because he had just built the shield and never expected it to break us, especially considering it was made from one of the most resistant materials in the kingdom. Fortunately, Van quickly uses his magic to repair the shield, restoring it completely, and Shara feels happy and relieved again. Just then, an adventurer arrives with a cart full of ores and tells Van about the many monsters he found in the forest, which allowed him to collect all those minerals. Van asks if he can test some of the iron ore, and the adventurer agrees. Van then uses the material to forge pure iron, and Shara is completely impressed with the result. Excited, Shara asks Van to help him by making a sword. Van accepts, feeling a bit guilty for breaking Shara's shield earlier. He concentrates carefully on the shape, balance, and density of the sword he wants to create. Using his skill, Van creates the finest-looking iron sword he can, and Shara absolutely loves it. Encouraged by this, Van makes an even longer sword, and the other adventurers want one for themselves too. Our protagonist tells them to go collect ores and promises to craft swords for everyone. Pluriel examines the sword Van made and realizes the quality is so high that it could likely be sold for a very steep price. Meanwhile, Espada notices that one of the extracted minerals is mithril, which is surprising since it is very unusual to find mithril in the forest. This leads him to believe there must be an undiscovered dungeon nearby. Considering the area hasn't been explored in a long time, everyone agrees this is very likely. Van smiles at the idea, knowing that discovering a new dungeon would make the village famous and important. Normally, when the Adventurers Guild learns of a new dungeon, they open a branch in the nearest city and send an elite group of adventurers, known as the Order of Knights. The problem, however, is that their village does not yet have the resources or infrastructure to support such a branch. Reporting it to the kingdom isn't an option either. Since Van was cast out and banished, if they discover the land he was sent to is valuable, they might relocate him elsewhere. No one wants that to happen. Therefore, Pluriel suggests that Van first grow the village and build all the necessary facilities and amenities before the dungeon is officially discovered, which would make it much harder for the House of Furcio to interfere. Everyone agrees with this plan, and Van thanks them for reaching the consensus. Shortly after, Van and Till are taking a peaceful walk when a group of armored lizards suddenly heads straight for the village. In response, Van orders everyone inside the walls and raises the gates to protect the villagers. Seeing the fear in their eyes, he reassures them and promises to fight for them. However, he knows he cannot win this battle with strength alone, so he asks the villagers to lend him their strength as well, so that together they can defend the village from the approaching threat. The townspeople are not willing to stand by and let Van fight his battles alone. They raise their voices and suggest they should all fight together as one group. They believe that working as a team will give them a better chance of survival. Van is very grateful for their support and courage. He tells everyone to move fast and head to the walls to prepare for the coming attack. Everyone gets to work immediately following Van's orders without wasting any time. Meanwhile, since Ortho's group is away hunting, they aren't there to assist with the defense. Our protagonist prepares to head up the wall to take his position and lead the effort. However, Till stops him at the last second. She is deeply concerned for his safety and doesn't want him in harm's way. Seeing her distress, Dio steps in to take Van's place for now. Dio tells Van that he will climb the wall instead and provide a report. After carefully observing the situation from the ramparts, Dio delivers the news. There are about 40 armored lizards advancing directly toward the village. This number is much higher than Van expected, leaving him visibly worried. Dio understands the gravity of the situation. He knows from experience that even a group of seasoned veterans would struggle to defeat a single armored lizard. Despite the overwhelming odds, Dio refuses to back down. He tells himself and the others that surrender is not an option. He orders everyone to man the ballistas and prepare to fire, vowing that he has never lost a battle in his life and won't let this be the first. His words bolster the village's fighting spirit. They fire several ballista bolts at the enemy and manage to take down 10 of the armored lizards. Dio is stunned. He quickly realizes this is a testament to how powerful Van's manufactured projectiles truly are. Soon after, they reload and fire again, successfully taking down the next wave. The villagers are filled with hope, but it doesn't last long. They soon realize they've run out of iron ammunition and several armored lizards are still closing in. Fear begins to spread. Dio realizes that if they don't act immediately, the village will be destroyed, and he considers charging into the fray himself to buy time. Just then, Van calls out and tells him to use the wooden bolts instead. The others are confused, believing wooden ammunition won't do any damage against skin as tough as steel. To them, it sounds like a desperate waste of time. However, Dio knows better than to doubt Van, trusting Van's judgment. Dio orders the knights to load the ballistas with the wooden bolts, to everyone's absolute surprise. The wooden bolts pierce the armored lizards directly through their heads. The shots are powerful enough to drill through them, wiping out the remaining threat. Dio is genuinely amazed. He cannot believe wooden bolts were so effective. Once Dio announces the victory, the entire village begins to celebrate in relief. The fact that they won with minimal ammunition and 0 casualties feels almost anticlimactic to Dio. This confirms his belief that Van is destined for greatness, not just as a lord, but as someone who will fundamentally change the future. Later that day, everyone begins to butcher and harvest the armored lizards. The villagers work together to clean and prepare everything they can use from the monsters. When Van sees the sheer amount of meat they obtained, he suggests they hold a massive banquet that night to celebrate. He believes everyone deserves to relax and eat well after such a dangerous battle. The banquet is a total success, and the villagers are extremely happy. They feel grateful and fortunate that a lord like Van was assigned to their village. Many feel they couldn't have asked for someone better to protect and lead them. The atmosphere is joyful, and the people feel more secure and hopeful about the future thanks to Van's leadership. Later, while sitting around the campfire, Ortho talks to Van about the value of the armored lizards. He explains that if sold to a merchant, a single armored lizard would normally fetch around 20 gold coins. However, in this case, most of the meat would spoil before it could be sold properly. After subtracting transportation costs and other expenses, Ortho says they would actually only net about 8 gold per piece. Van does the math in his head based on the amount of meat they harvested. He realizes that, after selling everything, they would be looking at a total of around 300 gold coins. In his previous life in Japan, that amount of money would have been equivalent to about 300 million yen. making him realize he is about to become incredibly rich. The idea of having that much wealth excites him for a moment. However, Espada quickly informs Van that whenever a village earns more than 100 gold, they are obligated to pay 50% of it in taxes to the marquise. Our protagonist is annoyed to realize he'll lose half the money. But he's even more worried about the attention it might bring. If they sell that much meat, the village will easily be noticed by higher authorities. Van fears that if his father finds out the village is accumulating such wealth and success, he might exile him to a different town. If that happens, he believes he'll never have the quiet, peaceful life he's always wanted. Espada points out a way to keep the situation a secret. They could give the credit for defeating the armored lizards to Van's eldest brother, Marisis. By doing this, the glory would fall on Mercis, and the village wouldn't draw as much unwanted attention. Van reflects on this plan and realizes it's a great idea, especially since Mercis hasn't added any major achievements to his name yet. The next day, two merchants arrive at the village. They had been told it was a small, remote town, but they are shocked upon arrival. The village is far more developed than they expected. The merchants introduce themselves as Bell and Rango, representatives of a popular trading company. Van invites them in for a closer look. The merchants are stunned by the sheer number of armored lizard hides the village has gathered. They didn't expect such a small place to be capable of defeating so many monsters. In fact, the scene makes them a bit fearful of the village's hidden power. Bell quickly agrees to buy all the hides and says he will send men to transport everything. Van is pleased, since the meat won't stay fresh for long. He even tells them they can take a portion for free if needed. In exchange, Van tells the merchants about the high-quality weapons he's been producing and asks if they'd be interested in buying them. Bell and Rango examine the weapons and are blown away by the quality. Impressed, they agree to buy every weapon Van has manufactured. When Van asks if they can help promote the weapons to increase sales, Bell and Rango hesitate for a moment. That hesitation makes Van realize they had originally planned to create a monopoly. Finding them somewhat naive, as he had already anticipated this, Van calmly suggests it would be better to find a way to maximize profits before promotions cause sales to skyrocket too fast. He suggests they set up a shop directly in his village. Bell and Rango are surprised by Van's generosity and are deeply grateful. Shortly after, it takes Van less than 5 minutes to build him a shop. Both merchants are even more shocked to see how quickly he raised the building from the ground. Meanwhile, Arte and Panamera waited outside the village gates, eager to find out if the rumors about the village lord being a prodigy were true. Later that day, Espada talked to Van about the growth of the town. He suggested that, given how things were developing, they should start planning for the village to eventually hold around 10,000 people. Van honestly thought that number sounded exaggerated, but Espada explained that considering the current pace of growth, it was a fitting goal. He pointed out they would need many people to protect the town, guard its facilities, and maintain general order. Our protagonist trusted Espada's judgment. If he was suggesting such a plan, it had to be a good idea. Consequently, Van thought about redesigning the town into a star shape, realizing this layout would make it much easier to defend in case of an attack. Just as he was considering this, one of the knights burst into the room and announced that emissaries from a neighboring county, Ferdinando, had arrived. Shortly after, Panamera and Arte entered Van's office. Panamera introduced herself first, explaining that she is a viscountess who rose through the ranks from a knight. Arte introduced herself as the youngest daughter of the House of Ferdinando, explaining she had come to pay her respects following her father's instructions. As they sat down to talk, Van spoke directly, stating he believed they had come to observe the village, evaluate a potential enemy, and learn from their success. Panamera burst into laughter, amazed that someone as young as Van Barely, 8 years old, was already capable of thinking so strategically. Since Van had been entrusted with this land, the county of Ferdinando feared he might eventually carry out his father's ambitions, which is why they were cautious. However, Van reassured them, explaining he was simply exiled to this village because he couldn't use elemental magic. Panamera immediately pointed out that this was a lie, or at least an understatement. She had seen how much the village had developed and calculated that it would have taken around 5,000 people to build it. Our protagonist remained silent for a moment, letting her speak, and then suddenly laughed. He said that, instead of explaining how the village developed so quickly, he would simply show them. They all went outside, and Van demonstrated his magic. He used production magic to create blocks and structures with incredible speed and precision. Neither Panamera nor Arte could believe their eyes. When Van explained his unique aptitude for production magic, Panamera thought his father's decision to exile him was incredibly foolish, as the king could have used Van's talent to expand the kingdom by that point. Panamera was completely convinced of Van's abilities. She confessed that the main reason she came was to offer Arte's hand in marriage to prevent any future conflict between the village and the county of Ferdinand. However, Van said there was no need for a marriage as long as Ferdinando didn't take extreme measures. There would be no reason for a confrontation. Panamera admitted she was originally against the idea because she assumed Van would be like other arrogant nobles. But after seeing his true character, she now fully supported the union. She even joked that if not for the age difference, she would have considered marrying him herself. When asked, Arte replied that she wasn't sure yet and needed time to think. Panamera reassured her, explaining they would spend the night in the village, giving her a full day to consider. Van agreed to let them stay and, in less than 5 minutes, used his magic to create a high-quality inn for them. That night, they dined together. Arte spent most of the meal talking to Van and observing his personality, noting how honest, kind, and responsible he was. Slowly, she began to fall for both him and the people of the village. After dinner, Van escorted his guests to their rooms. As they reached the doors, Panamera wished him good night and went inside, while Arte thanked him for everything he had done that day, somewhat awkwardly wishing him good night as well. Our protagonist realized something important. Since Arte was sent as part of a marriage proposal, it was likely she had also been pushed aside by her own people for not being a powerful elemental mage. Realizing they were not so different, Van decided to prioritize Arte's wishes and comfort in every decision he made from then on. That night, before going to sleep, Arte hugs her pillow and thinks about the next day. She intends to start a conversation with Van, truly looking forward to seeing what the new day will bring. The next morning, Van is awakened by Till and Kamshin. They tell him to go to the lake right away because they have just seen something strange. Van feels a bit reluctant to get out of bed, especially since it's so early, but after they both persist for a while, he finally gets up and follows them. When he reaches the lake, he sees a group of villagers gathered around. Our protagonist moves to the front and is surprised to see what appears to be a mermaid floating in the water, her head poking above the surface. Espada explains that this creature is called an akpiu. It's a rare species that people almost never encounter, so Van can't help but wonder what brought her to his village. Van tries to talk to her, but she ignores him and continues to stare. Deciding that offering food might show friendship, he gives her a plate of meat. As he brings it closer to the water, she immediately swims toward him and asks if she can have it. Van says yes, and she takes a piece and eats it. She quickly realizes it's not normal meat from common animals, but armored lizard meat. She asks where it came from and who defeated the monster. Everyone knows Van is too modest to admit he was the one who did it. So the villagers speak up and say it was through Van's power. Upon hearing this, the Akpayu immediately dives back into the water and returns to where she came from. Espada notes that Akpayu are rarely seen, so they probably won't be back for a while, but he is wrong. The next day, an entire village of Akpayu arrives at the lake. Van is surprised, wondering if they returned because they heard he defeated the armored lizards, making him think they viewed him as a powerful god. However, Espada says that's unlikely, as he has never heard of such a thing. A large and intimidating Akpiu man asks to speak with Van. He asks if it was truly him who defeated the armored lizards. When Van confirms it, all the Akpo in the water are shocked. They can't believe such a young boy could defeat them. The man introduces himself as Lada Vesta, the ruler of the Ace. He mentions that the girl Van met yesterday is his daughter, Priora, and that he is offering her to Van in marriage. Our protagonist is immediately shocked, especially since Priora is still a child and probably doesn't even know what marriage means. Van asks Vesta if there is a specific reason for this offer. Vesta nods and explains that for many years, their village has been attacked and threatened by armored lizards. These creatures have caused fear and trouble for his people, making life dangerous. So, when he heard there was a lord in this village strong enough to defeat them, he thought offering his daughter as a wife would help protect his people and form an alliance with someone powerful. Van listens carefully and realizes that Vesta is not offering his daughter for personal reasons or family desires, but solely as a way to create an alliance and keep his village safe. With this in mind, Van tells Vesta that the marriage is unnecessary. He promises to do everything in his power to protect the Akpeyu from any danger without requiring Priora to marry him. Vesta is surprised. He didn't expect Van to respond so calmly and kindly. Still, he says that if Van insists, his village is willing to move to the settlement, to be closer to his protection. Our protagonist has no problem with this arrangement, so he immediately begins to build a large resting area for them, a place where they can relax, gather, and feel comfortable. When Vesta sees the area, he is astonished. He can't believe Van was able to build such a large and well-planned space in so little time. The Akpeyu move into the new area and quickly begin to enjoy it. But just as everything seems to be settling in, Espada approaches Van to remind him that it's almost time to handle the village's sewage. Van smiles and tells Espada not to worry, as he has already planned a system. There are pipes running under every house in the village, so all they need to do is release water from the lake to flush the waste through the pipes and keep the village clean. Vesta watches closely and finds it fascinating. Impressed by Van's ingenuity, he offers to help. Van says it isn't necessary, but Vesta insists, explaining that they are experts with water and can handle the task without a problem. Van finally accepts, allowing some of the Akpeyu to manage opening the dam and releasing the water. When the work is done, Van sincerely thanks everyone for their help. Vesta observes that this cleaning process should be done several times a day and suggests they take over this task regularly as their way of contributing to the village. Van thinks it's an excellent idea and a great help, thanking Vesta once again for the considerate suggestion. At that moment, Arte and Panamera arrive. Both are completely shocked to see the Akpeyu leader, as they had never seen one in real life before. Just before Lada Vesta leaves, he refers to Van as his son-in-law. This makes Arte a bit jealous, as it sounds like Van has already married an Akpeyu. Van quickly denies it, trying to explain himself. But before he can say another word, Priora suddenly leaps out of the water, calls Van her husband, and swims away. This only makes the situation more awkward. To clear the air, Van takes Arte for a peaceful boat ride on the lake. He explains everything in detail, assuring her that nothing has happened between him and Priora. After talking for a while, Arte finally understands it was all a big misunderstanding. They spend the next few minutes enjoying each other's company. However, Priora and a group of her friends swim up to the boat. Seeing Van alone with Arte makes Priora jealous. When Van reminds her they aren't even married, Priora dives underwater in frustration. The other Akpeyu, seeing their princess upset, begin to rock the boat from side to side, scaring both Van and Arte as the vessel sways dangerously. Later, Lada Vesta takes on a serious expression. Upon hearing that Van was flirting with Arte while Priora was nearby, our protagonist tries to explain they aren't engaged, but Vesta interrupts him. He proposes a competition to settle the matter. If the Akpeyu win, Van will be officially betrothed to Priora. Van thinks the idea is ridiculous, but Dio suddenly appears and accepts the challenge immediately, daring them to try. The rest of the group, eager to defeat the Akpeyu, supports the idea, eventually convincing Van to go along with it. Van is given the choice for the first event. He suggests a simple game of volleyball. No one there has ever heard of the game, assuming it's another of Van's ingenious inventions. However, Dio and Panamera seem more excited about the swimsuits than the game itself. The first round is set, Till and Panamera versus Lada Vesta and Priora. The game begins, and Van is quickly surprised by how good the Akpeyu are. They dominate the match, winning round after round. Despite a late-game rally fueled by Panamera's encouragement, the human team's motivation isn't enough. Lada Vesta and Priora win the first round convincingly. Since Van chose the first test, it is now Lada Vesta's turn. He chooses a swimming relay race. Van immediately realizes how unfair this is, as the Akpeyu are natural-born swimmers. Suddenly feeling the pressure of a forced marriage, Van watches as Dio and Kamshin volunteer to be his swimmers. The race starts, and Kamshin pushes himself to the limit to keep pace with Priora, even managing to overtake her for a brief second before the handoff. Dio takes over and dominates instantly. His powerful butterfly strokes propel him far ahead, leaving the Akpeiyu struggling to catch up. Van watches in awe as Dio wins the race. La de Vesta is incredulous, wondering how his team of half-fish could lose a swimming race. However, Vesta isn't ready to give up hope. One final test remains. It is Van's turn to choose the challenge. He thinks carefully and quickly creates an ice machine, announcing that the final event will be a shaved ice speed-eating contest. Noticing she hasn't participated yet, Arte volunteers and Van joins her. As the contest begins, everyone suffers from intense brain freeze after the first few spoonfuls, but they push through. Despite the discomfort, Van is determined to avoid the marriage, and Arte is determined to win for Van's sake. Using that as their motivation, they manage to finish their bowls first, winning the challenge and the overall competition. La de Vesta, showing good sportsmanship, offers Van a handshake before swimming away. However, he still calls Van his son-in-law and reminds him to take care of Priora. Our protagonist sighs in frustration. Even after winning, Vesta speaks as if the marriage were still inevitable. Meanwhile, everyone congratulates Van on his performance, surrounding him with smiles and praise. RTE watches Van, surrounded by happy faces, and feels inspired. She had never experienced anything like this before. As a child, her parents always neglected her because they thought she was a failure. She was shy and never stood out until she learned puppet magic, which allowed her to move her dolls freely. For the first time, she hoped her mother would be proud of her. Instead, her mother slapped her, saying puppet magic was evil and forbidden among nobles. After that, Arte became an outcast. When she turned 10, a commitment was arranged with Fan Shi, expected him to be like the rude nobles she had known. But Van was different kind, patient, and possessed an unusual talent for production magic, which was considered useless by noble standards. Despite that, he was confident and used his magic to help the village. Seeing Van's example, Arte decides she wants to be like him, telling herself that if she works harder, she will be able to see the world as he does the next morning. Van calls a meeting with all the villagers. He announces that they need to build additional walls for the village's future development. He also explains that since tomorrow is their day off, they will have a big barbecue tonight. This excites the villagers, and they set to work with renewed enthusiasm. At that moment, Arte approaches Van and asks if she can watch him work. Van agrees, allowing her to learn from him. While this is happening, deep in the forest, Ortho and the other adventurers are being pursued by something powerful and dangerous, signaling that another challenge is approaching. Back in the village, the others have no idea what is happening outside. They are busy admiring the walls Van finished in less than 2 weeks. The walls are sturdy, high, and imposing, and everyone is amazed at how quickly he completed them. Panamera approaches Van, clearly shocked, admitting she always knew he was capable, but never imagined he could achieve something like this. As she moved, Van was briefly distracted and embarrassed. So he quickly told Panamera he was going to oversee the construction of more houses, as more people, merchants, adventurers, and other visitors planned to move to the village. Panamera confessed she felt a bit envious. Since she was a child, she had dreamed of having her own land. Seeing Van with so much responsibility made her wish for something similar. She decided that in the next big battle, she would strive to win more than just money. She wanted to prove her worth and secure her own piece of land to manage. As Panamera looked around, her attention was caught by the massive machines on the walls. She asked Van what they were, and he explained they were giant ballistas, powerful long-range weapons, intended to stop enemies before they could reach the village walls. To show her how strong they were, Van asked Kamshin to fire one as a test. The projectile shot out with incredible force, producing thousands of newtons of impact, leaving Panamera stunned. She couldn't believe a weapon built by Van could be so powerful. To her surprise, she learned Van had several of these ballistas. She immediately asked how much he would charge for one, hoping to buy it for herself. However, Van said they were not for sale. Determined, she asked if she could have one. In exchange for a favor she would owe him in the future. Our protagonist accepted, and Panamera felt a surge of excitement. She realized the ballistas were extremely heavy and would require a carriage for transport. But since the projectiles were made of iron, she could manufacture more herself when needed. At that moment, Kamshin approached and suggested that Panamera take one or two of Van's special projectiles, as they were different from common ones. To demonstrate their strength, Kamshin took out a sword made by Van and sliced Panamera's spare sword in two, without the slightest effort. Panamera's eyes widened in shock. She asked Van what material he had used. He explained it was made of common iron, yet was capable of piercing even the toughest armored lizards. Finally, Van allowed her to take a ballista and some special projectiles. Van turns around and sees Ortho and his group running out of the forest at full speed, pursued by a massive forest dragon. Ortho screams at Van and the others, telling them to run for their lives and get behind the walls to warn the villagers. He explains that he plans to act as a decoy to distract the dragon for now, buying the village time to prepare. A chill runs down Van's spine. Leaving Ortho and his group behind would be a death sentence for them. He wonders if they should stay and fight, but he hesitates, knowing that taking such a risk could also put the villagers in mortal danger. Panamera steps forward with serene determination. She tells Van not to worry and assures him that she will help face the forest dragon. She barks orders for everyone to get behind the walls and stay safe. She also informs Ortho and his group that they will use the ballistas to attack the dragon from a distance. Van approaches Arte and apologizes for letting her witness such a terrifying scene. But he quickly reassures her, saying there is nothing to fear. They have the enhanced ballistas ready for the main attack, and Panamera will lead the assault. After that, Van tells Till to escort Arte inside the walls and asks her to call for Dio and the other soldiers for support. When the forest dragon finally comes into range, the ballistas fire the first shots. Bolts and projectiles streak through the air, but the dragon dodges every single one of them. Van's heart sinks. His best weapons seem almost useless against this creature, and he begins to wonder how they could possibly survive. Then, with a flash of light and a surge of energy, Panamera summons her fire magic. She hurls a massive fire javelin directly at the forest dragon. The spell impacts with devastating force, sending flames along the dragon's scales and causing considerable damage. Everyone watches in awe, having no idea that Panamera was such a talented elemental mage capable of wielding such powerful and precise magic. However, even Panamera's powerful magic was not enough. Though the fire javelin hit it head-on and scorched its scales, the dragon did not fall. Instead, it took flight and charged directly at them. Van quickly ordered the soldiers to fire a full volley. The ballistas launched several massive bolts into the air. After numerous shots, some projectiles managed to pierce the dragon's wings. Van saw this as a good sign. If its wings were damaged, it might not be able to fly properly. Van ordered a second volley. The soldiers fired again, but this time the forest dragon reacted with greater speed. It seemed to understand the trajectory of every shot, twisting its body in midair to dodge every projectile one by one. Our protagonist was shocked by how intelligent and fast the dragon was. Meanwhile, Ortho and his group finally managed to reach the other side of the wall, relieved to be alive. Van was also glad they were safe, but he knew that staying there only meant more danger. If the dragon attacked again, everyone would be at risk. All Van needed was a small opening so they could retreat toward the village. At that moment, Panamera created that opportunity. She launched another powerful fire javelin. The attack hit the dragon squarely, burning its wings and stalling it for a brief instant. That was exactly what Van needed. He immediately ordered everyone to retreat into the village, and they ran without wasting a second. However, the dragon did not take long to recover. Once it regained its strength, it leaped onto the wall and glared down at them from above. Van looked back and was stunned by how quickly it had regenerated. After taking such a powerful fire javelin, it should have been gravely wounded, yet it stood firm. Then, Espada walked calmly toward the forest dragon. Without showing any panic, Espada used an earth spell and covered the dragon with enormous rocks, immobilizing it for a short time. After casting the spell, he calmly walked away and told Van that it should give them enough time to reach the village. The others rushed toward the village as fast as they could, but Van knew that even with Espada's help, they needed more time. If they didn't delay the dragon again, it would catch up to them very soon. He returned to the village gates and told Panamera that he wanted to claim that favor she owed him. He explained his plan clearly. When the forest dragon arrived, he wanted her to use her fire javelin to pin it down. While it was trapped, they would use the ballistas to finish it off. Panamera agreed to the plan, but when the forest dragon finally reached the village, the ballistas were not yet fully loaded. They needed more time to prepare. Van understood they had to delay the dragon once more. At that moment, Dio and his men ran out into the open field, carrying the high-level weapons Van had manufactured for them. Their goal was to hold back the dragon for a short time. They fought bravely, but the forest dragon quickly overwhelmed them. Realizing they couldn't defeat it in close combat, they retreated back to the village. He gave the signal to She immediately used her fire javelin ability, striking the forest dragon and leaving it immobilized just as they had planned. At that exact moment, the ballistas were ready. The soldiers fired the heavy iron bolts, which struck the dragon directly, causing massive damage. Dio cautiously approached the dragon to check if it had finally been defeated. The dragon lay motionless. Suddenly, one of its eyes snapped open. Dio reacted instantly, raised his sword, and decapitated the dragon with a single clean cut. Everyone understood that the forest dragon had finally been defeated. The soldiers and villagers erupted in celebration. Arte and Till ran toward Van, asking if he was okay. He assured them he was fine. Panamera then approached Van and praised him for devising such an intelligent plan at the last second. She realized then that the people of this village are far from ordinary. No normal village would have survived an attack from a forest dragon. Most would have been raised without even a chance to defend themselves. Putting that aside, Panamera told Van they should hold a ceremony for defeating the dragon to honor Dio and the others. They were the ones who inflicted the most damage, and Dio was the one who delivered the final blow. According to tradition, whoever finishes off a dragon earns the title of Dragon Slayer. Van agreed with her suggestion. Shortly after, a ceremony was organized in the main square. The people cheered for those who risked their lives to protect the village. Panamera stepped forward and honored each combatant one by one, praising their bravery and strength. Finally, they called Van to the front. She declared that none of them would be alive today if it weren't for his quick thinking and brilliant plan. At those words, the entire village burst into loud applause and an ovation for him. As Panamera watched Van, she began to reflect on her own past. Since rising as a low-ranking knight, she had met many people of noble blood and high status. She had worked with commanders, lords, and officers of every rank. However, she had never met anyone like Van Panamera. Was born into a long line of knights in the royal capital. When her great talent for elemental magic was discovered, she was taken to the county at a young age and underwent grueling training. Her efforts bore fruit. At just 16, she became a squad commander, and after 6 years of service and numerous victories, she was promoted to the rank of Viscountess. One day, she met with the Lord of Ferdinand, who told her he planned to marry his youngest daughter Arte to the lord of a distant land. That was when Panamera first became linked to Arte's future. At first, Panamera worried that the man Arte would marry would be incompetent or weak. However, after meeting Van, she realized how wrong she was. She could clearly see that Arte had changed by his side. She was no longer as shy as before, and now expressed her thoughts with a courage she had never shown in the past. With these thoughts in mind, Panamera made a bold announcement in front of the villagers. As a Viscountess of the noble empire, she declared that she would form an alliance with Van. Our protagonist was surprised to hear this, as he hadn't expected such an offer. However, he quickly understood how much this alliance could benefit both him and the village. With his father having cut ties with him, and with very few noble connections remaining, this was an opportunity that might never present itself again. After a brief moment of reflection, Van accepts her proposal, and with that agreement, the alliance between Van and Viscountess Panamera officially begins. The next day, with the forest dragon finally out of the picture, Espada meets with Van and suggests it is time to begin preparations for the city's planning. He explains that this small village could be transformed into a city capable of housing around 10,000 people. However, to reach that goal, Espada points out that they will need to find a way to attract new inhabitants. Just then, Till and Kamshin arrive to inform Van that Bell and Rango have returned, along with merchants from the Mari Trading Company. These merchants are interested in buying the materials obtained from the forest dragon, which excites Van greatly. He sees this as the first step toward building his future city. Shortly after, the merchants examine the defeated forest dragon and are shocked to see it is real and not just a myth. After reviewing all the parts, the merchants conclude the dragon is worth 100 platinum coins. Van quickly calculates that 1 platinum coin is roughly equivalent to 1 million yen in his previous life, meaning the dragon's total value is about 10 billion yen. However, when Van asks how much they are willing to pay, the merchants get nervous and offer only 60 platinum. Van is disappointed, as he had clearly heard them mention 100 platinum just minutes before. He goes to consult with Belle and Rango, causing the merchants to panic. After Van explains the situation, Belle and Rango declare it completely unfair. Knowing the dragon should sell for much more, the corrupt merchants pull Belle and Rango aside, reminding them that they all belong to the same merchant guild, and that since Van has no other buyers, he will have no choice but to accept. Belle and Rango refuse to cooperate, stating they respect Van too much to cheat him. Van, standing nearby, overhears the entire conversation. Enraged by their defiance, the merchants leave in a fury, warning Belle and Rango that they will be expelled from the guild for this betrayal. Despite the threat, Belle and Rango insist it was worth it because they could never bring themselves to deceive Van. Hearing this, Van naturally suggests, "Then why don't you create your own trading company?" Belle and Rango are stunned, explaining that founding a company isn't easy. It requires 3 conditions. First, paying the guild registration fee. Second, having their own shop. And third, obtaining the sponsorship of a titled noble. Van reasons that the first 2 are easy, but the noble sponsorship is the real challenge. He realizes the only person he knows with a respectable title who might help is Panamera. He asks her for her backing, and to his surprise, she agrees immediately. Panamera explains that it would be great publicity for her county to have helped found an honest company from scratch. In return, Van offers to give her the credit for defeating the forest dragon to boost her status and avoid unnecessary attention for himself. However, Panamera tells him that won't work. Any serious investigation would eventually lead back to him anyway. She reassures him that there is a better way. Van should obtain his own title. As the son of a marquis, he wouldn't have to start as a lowly knight. He could likely start as a baron. Furthermore, if it is publicly declared that he defeated the forest dragon, he could earn an even more prestigious title. Van begins to panic at the thought, realizing he would stand out far too much. Panamera tells him not to see it that way. He should consider it an honor that adds prestige to his name. Still, Van worries that if he takes all the credit for the dragon, Panamera's own request for promotion might be rejected because he would be stealing all the recognition. Panamera listens to Van's concerns and adopts a very firm tone, telling him that she doesn't need an 8-year-old boy worrying about her. With that, she decides to let him take all the credit for defeating the dragon. Afterward, Van meets with Belle and Rango to tell them that Panamera has officially agreed to sponsor them. The moment they hear this, they are filled with relief and emotion, genuinely grateful that she was willing to support them despite the risks. To show their gratitude, they offer to pay Van 130 platinum coins for the forest dragon. Van is in shock at the amount. It is even more than what the other merchants had originally valued it at. Belle and Rango insist it is the least they can do after everything he has done for them. They explain that without him, they never would have had such an opportunity in the first place. However, once the excitement dies down, a new problem arises. The 2 merchants from the previous trade group took all the cargo carriages when they left. This means Belle and Rango have no way to transport the massive body of the forest dragon. Without transport, they cannot move the materials to sell them, and their plans would collapse immediately at that moment. Panamera calmly approaches them and explains that this was likely the merchants' plan from the beginning. They expected Belle and Rango to panic and come crawling back for help. Panamera makes it clear she has no intention of letting that happen. Instead, she offers to lend them her warhorse is strong and extremely fast, far superior to a common pack horse. With her support, Belle and Rango won't need to depend on their old group at all. Meanwhile, the 2 merchants who stole the carriages are riding away with total confidence, laughing and certain that Belle and Rango will soon return begging for forgiveness. In their minds, there is no way the 2 could transport such valuable merchandise without help. But as they move along, they suddenly hear the sound of powerful hooves behind them. Before they can react, a swift horse overtakes them at an impressive speed. Looking back, they recognize Panamera's warhorse, with Belle and Rango mounted on it. It only takes them a second to grasp the situation. With the backing of a titled noble, Belle and Rango can now create their own trading company. They are no longer dependent on the old merchant guild. The two merchants are paralyzed with shock, screaming in disbelief as they realize they have lost their advantage entirely. After resolving that matter, Panamera appears before the ruler of the empire, King Dino, and formally requests that he grant a title to Van. She explains that he has achieved several remarkable feats and deserves recognition. At first, King Dino is visibly surprised. Hearing that Van is only 8 years old and already ruling a small village makes him skeptical. He also learns that Van possesses a great aptitude for production magic, which is unusual for someone so young. Even so, Dino assumes a child that age would likely be an incompetent lord. Panamera calmly begins to list Van's achievements one by one, explaining how he has improved the village, strengthened its economy, and managed his people responsibly. As she continues, King Dino's distrust begins to fade. He starts to realize that Van is no ordinary child. The moment that impacts him most is when he sees the dragon fang Panamera brought as proof, confirming that Van was indeed the one who defeated the forest dragon. Defeating a dragon is no small feat, even for experienced warriors. For an 8-year-old to have achieved it is extraordinary. Because of this, King Dino becomes seriously interested in Van. He tells Panamera that he wants to meet him as soon as possible and orders her to arrange a meeting so he can judge the boy with his own eyes. Shortly after, Panamera takes to the streets of the empire and publicly announces that Van was the one who defeated the forest dragon. The news spreads rapidly. The commoners are shocked and find it hard to believe. Many know Van is the banished son of a marquise, and the idea that such a young, discredited boy achieved something so great seems impossible to them. Panamera feels satisfied seeing how strongly the people are reacting to the news. The excitement spreading through the streets confirms Panamera's belief that Van will almost certainly be granted a title. The public already sees him as someone extraordinary, and such a reputation is difficult for the crown to ignore. With the story of the forest dragon spreading further every day, Panamera feels confident that her efforts will soon yield results. Meanwhile, since Panamera left the village, Van has been completely focused on construction and development. He begins building houses with a more organized and uniform design, ensuring the settlement looks structured rather than scattered. The streets are straighter, the spacing between buildings is better planned, and the overall layout feels more like a planned city than an improvised village. In addition, Van builds several tall watchtowers around the perimeter. These towers allow the guards to detect approaching enemies from a great distance, providing enough early warning to prepare defenses. It is another sign that Van is thinking long-term about security and growth. When lunchtime arrives, everyone decides to climb one of the towers to eat together. From the top, they can see the expanding settlement beneath them, Espada observes, the large, well-built houses, and the advanced facilities Van has created, commenting that it no longer feels right to call this place a village. In his opinion, it has already become a town. The original name was Van Village. After some debate, the others suggest that Van Town would be a more appropriate name. Van isn't too thrilled about naming the place after himself, but seeing how convinced the others are, he realizes there's no point in arguing. During the meal, Arte suddenly blushes as she calls out to Van with some shyness. She tells him that from now on, she wants him to call her by her first name without any honorifics. Our protagonist is simply glad that she feels comfortable enough with him to ask for such a thing, so he accepts without hesitation. At that moment, Kamshin points toward the main gates. A group of strangers is standing outside the town walls. Van and Espada go down immediately to investigate. They discover that these visitors come from a nearby village that is going through severe hardships. Their leader explains they are struggling to pay taxes because they no longer have enough young people to work. Van is confused and asks why they lack young workers. The elder explains that Sakanda took all the young men and women to work in his own domain. As a result, their village is left mostly with the elderly and children. Without labor, they cannot produce enough to survive, let alone pay taxes. Van listens carefully. He understands that getting involved with people from another domain could lead to political conflicts. Fraternizing across borders isn't always prudent. Still, he cannot ignore their plight. His conscience won't allow him to close the gates on them. After careful thought, Van offers to take them in and allow them to settle in his town. The village leader is shocked, struggling to process what he just heard. Van reassures him that he is serious. When the leader mentions they are about 300 people, Van calmly responds that he will prepare one house per family. The villagers and their chief are overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. Furthermore, Van learns that they have cows. The instant he hears this, his mind fills with ideas about milk, cheese, butter, and other dairy products he could produce. It is a practical opportunity for both parties. They gain security and work, and he gains resources and labor. Later, that night, Ortho and his group are given the mission to safely escort the 300 villagers to Vantown. During the journey, the adventurers can't help but comment on how generous Van is. Taking in so many people without hesitation is not something most lords would do. By the time they arrive, Van has prepared a warm welcome. Despite the short notice, he organizes large barbecues with plenty of meat. The newcomers are received with warmth and treated to a generous meal. It isn't easy to organize such an event on short notice, but when Van sees the expressions of relief on their faces, he knows it was worth it. As the night progresses, some villagers worry about how they will make a living. Our protagonist reassures them, explaining that there are many job opportunities available. With ongoing construction, agriculture, and future industries, there is enough employment for everyone. The villagers are deeply moved. Van had no obligation to help them, yet he chose to open his doors to them. To close the night on a joyful note, Van even served strawberry shortcake for dessert, turning the arrival of the new villagers into true celebration and marking the beginning of their new lives in Vantown. Life in the town has been quiet and peaceful. All the major construction projects are finally finished. The roads are ready, the houses repaired, and everything looks better than ever. Because of this, Espada believes it is the perfect time for Van to resume his studies, feeling that Van has neglected his books for too long. Our protagonist strongly disagrees. He feels he deserves a long break after working so hard for the town. For him, being forced to study now feels completely unfair. Just then, Ortho and his group appear out of nowhere, looking nervous. They quickly apologize to Van and explain that they accidentally discovered the entrance to a dungeon near the town. This is exactly what everyone hoped wouldn't happen. Espada reacts with gravity. If a dungeon entrance has truly been discovered, they must inform the royal capital immediately. It is major news that cannot be ignored. Van begins to think carefully. If news of the dungeon spreads, adventurers from all over the empire will flock to his town. His quiet home will become noisy and overcrowded. Worse yet, his father might find out about the development Van has achieved and might try to transfer him elsewhere. Ortho's team feels guilty for the discovery, but Van tells them not to worry since the dungeon has been found. There is no way to hide it, knowing that Kasala, the scout of Ortho's team, was the one who found it. Van asks him to travel to the royal capital to report the news. While the team wants to go together, Van has a different plan. He asks the rest of the group to stay near the dungeon to gather more information. He mentions there will be a gold reward for the task. The moment they hear the word gold, they immediately change their minds and joyfully wish Kasala a safe trip. Kasala also receives a special reward from Van, a short sword made of mithril. Mithril is an extremely rare and valuable metal, making this gift incredibly precious. Kasala accepts the mission with pride. As he rides through the open fields toward the royal capital, he can't stop admiring his new blade. Suddenly, he spots an overturned carriage surrounded by several massive orcs, each nearly 2.5 meters tall. Normally, facing such enemies alone would be difficult, but with his mithril sword, Kasala charges into combat. The sword slices through the orcs with ease, and he defeats them all without much effort. After the fight, a young woman emerges from hiding and introduces herself as Flameria. She is impressed by his skill and assumes he must be a famous adventurer. Kasala humbly explains he is just a common adventurer passing through. Flameria thanks him for saving her life and explains that her father used to be a baron, but he died in a conflict and their lands were seized, homeless and without a title. She was heading to the capital to find work as a maid. After hearing her story, Kasala makes an unexpected proposal. Instead of going to the capital to be a servant, he suggests she move to Vantown. He explains that there are many job opportunities there as the town is growing fast, and assures her it is a safe and well-protected place. Touched by his kindness, Flameria accepts. Meanwhile, back in town, Van is already preparing for the future. Now that the dungeon has been discovered, he knows many adventurers will soon arrive. To manage the situation, Van devises a plan. Decides to build a small outpost town near the dungeon entrance. This town will help control the flow of adventurers and maintain order. Van plans to appoint Espada as the governor of this new settlement, believing he is responsible enough for the role. He also wants Ortho and his group to serve as the local order of knights to keep the peace. Construction of the outpost begins immediately, and the work progresses smoothly. Observing the steady progress, Van calculates that the outpost should be finished in about a month. Not long after, Kasala returns to the town alongside Flameria. Van notices the unknown girl and asks who she is. Flameria politely explains that Kasala saved her from orcs on the road. As Van watches them speak, he quickly realizes something. It's clear that both feel something for each other. Still, he makes no comment about it. Instead, he gives Flameria a warm welcome to Vantown. The town is growing, and new residents are always welcome. Suddenly, a large group of adventurers is seen riding toward the town. For a moment, Van panics, wondering if a disaster has arrived. Kasala quickly tells him to calm down. It's not an invasion, but simply adventurers coming to explore and farm the dungeon. Van sighs in relief, knowing this is just the beginning of a busy new chapter for the town. From a distance, the group of adventurers looked intimidating with rough faces, loud voices, and heavy armor. At first glance, they seemed dangerous. However, once they arrived, Van realized they weren't as bad as they appeared. They simply had a coarse personality. Initially, they were noisy and somewhat rude, but after Espada intervened and firmly put them in their place, their attitude changed quickly. They began to behave properly and treat the townspeople with respect. In the end, most of them were simply astonished. They couldn't believe that Van, at only 8 years old, was capable of being a lord and managing a growing town so well. Shortly after, Ortho and his group returned. The moment Ortho saw Flameria, he immediately asked Kasala who she was. Kasala calmly explained she was the young woman he had rescued during his trip. Ortho looked at both of them and understood the situation instantly. It was evident they had feelings for each other. Filled with dramatic frustration, Ortho shouted, annoyed that Kasala had gotten a girlfriend before him. Setting that aside, Van turned to Pluriel and asked for a report on the dungeon area. Pluriel reported that, surprisingly, there were few monsters near the entrance. She explained that dungeons normally have hostile environments, which is why adventurers usually build small camps nearby, as building anything large is generally impossible. However, Van possesses special powers that make large-scale construction possible. Pluriel clearly had something in mind. Our protagonist already suspected what she was about to ask. Just as he expected, Pluriel said she wanted his help to build near the dungeon. Van quickly reminds her that he has a strict curfew and cannot stay out for long. Pluriel promises that she and the others will protect him at all times and that the work won't take too long. Van hesitates. To be honest, he prefers building and improving the main town rather than working near the dungeon. Hoping Pluriel would give up on the idea, he lists several unreasonable demands. He presents them as strict conditions that must be met before he accepts. To his surprise, Pluriel accepts every single condition without hesitation. Calmly, she states they could start the work the very next day. Van stands frozen, realizing his plan to avoid the task had completely failed. The next day, Van reluctantly gets into a carriage headed for the dungeon. The road is uneven and full of potholes. The trip is so bumpy that Kamshin begins to get motion sick. As they advance, they encounter a giant troll blocking the way. The adventurers work together quickly and defeat it in record time. After the battle, they shout with enthusiasm and celebrate their victory. Their shouting starts to annoy Van, but Till and Artie seem to be enjoying the excitement, which makes him feel a bit better as they continue the journey. Van suddenly looks out the carriage window and urgently tells the driver to stop. In front of them is a deep ditch with only 2 long wooden logs placed over it as a makeshift bridge. The adventurers see no problem. They are used to taking risks and rushing forward without thinking about safety. However, Van understands that this kind of careless behavior can lead to serious accidents. He decides that this must change. He makes the grown men kneel and reflect on their carelessness. The logs were unstable and lacked proper support. Even a bit of pressure could have caused them to collapse. To solve the problem, he uses his power to build a strong, stable bridge. With the new bridge in place, everyone crosses safely. After arriving at the dungeon area, Van begins planning the next steps. He knows the adventurers will need a proper base of operations. First, he builds a massive gate to prevent monsters from escaping the dungeon area. Then, he erects a luxurious 5-star hotel where adventurers can rest after a long day of hunting monsters. The building is impressive, and the adventurers are clearly satisfied, enjoying the comfort and thanking him for the high-quality facilities. As the sun begins to set, our protagonist remembers his curfew. He doesn't want Espada to get angry with him again. Before leaving, he puts Ortho in charge of managing the base and asks him to supervise the adventurers. Just as they are preparing to depart, Arte notices something unusual nearby. She points out a piece of ore embedded in the ground. After careful examination, they confirm it is myth. Van praises Arte for her sharp observation and quick thinking. At nightfall, they return to the village. Waiting for them at the entrance is Espada, wearing a silent but unsettling smile. Van immediately gets nervous. He knows what happens when he doesn't respect his curfew. In a panic, he begs for help. But the others avoid getting involved. They are too scared to face Espada. Only Arte gathers enough courage to step forward, trying to explain that it wasn't Van's fault. However, Espada firmly orders her to be silent and withdraw. Without another word, Espada grabs Van and drags him back into the village, leaving the others behind in an awkward silence. The next day, Van and Arte are seen walking through the village. Noticing how long she has been there, Van asks if she plans to stay permanently. When Arte hesitates, Van assumes she is pressured by expectations and encourages her to focus on what she truly wants. Blushing, Arte admits she wants to be betrothed to him. Van, clearly happy though, trying to remain composed, shares the moment of joy with her. Later, Belle and Rango return from the royal capital. Thanks to Van's support, they successfully establish their trading company. As a token of gratitude, they pay him 30 platinum coins. When Van hands the payment to Till, she is left speechless. It is the largest sum of money she has ever handled. Campson mentions that Panamera is busy in Count Ferdinand's territory, but Belle and Rango reveal a surprise. Panamera believes forming an alliance with Van is better than staying under the Count's command. She won't live inside the village, but will be granted land nearby. Van realizes it was only a matter of time, noting that Panamera is the type of person who always gets what she wants. The merchants present Van with a masterpiece from the capital, a box that transforms into a mechanical crossbow capable of firing 10 consecutive shots. While Van is excited to replicate it, his first attempt isn't perfect. Seeing this, Arte realizes that even someone as talented as Van can fail. Van humbly admits that, aside from his production magic, he isn't particularly good at anything else. When Van asks about Arte's magic, she hesitantly reveals she has an aptitude for puppet, magic a craft often looked down upon. To encourage her, Van creates a wooden puppet. As Arte controls it, Van is amazed by its graceful, lifelike movements. He immediately sees its potential, suggesting they host a puppet show for the villagers. He even offers to make a puppet out of the mithril she found. Van shares his own experience. He was once called a failure because of his production magic. Yet that same magic saved the village. This inspires Arte to finally find confidence in her own power. That night, the villagers gather in the square. When they see the puppet, some whisper about how puppet magic was once used to attack the royal family. Sensing Arte's fear, Van watches as she gathers her courage and performs a beautiful dance with the marionette. Instead of rejection, the villagers break into thunderous applause, asking for an encore. Overwhelmed with emotion, Arte thanks Van for helping her see her own strength. Panamera returns. Noting Arte's newfound confidence, suddenly, She tells Van to kneel. King Dino of Scuderia has arrived. The king officially grants Van the title of Baron. The king is skeptical of the stories about the village's defenses and the forest dragon. Van explains his ballistas and production methods. When Van mentions the massive walls took only 4 months to build, the king and his chancellor Apata are stunned. The tour continues, showing the rare Akpo fish and Van's seamless collaboration with Apertus Earth, magic to build structures instantly dot as a gift. A piece of orichalcum, the metal of the gods, is offered. Van instantly crafts it into a sword, but tries to hide it, embarrassed by how easy it was. Following Panamera's advice, to be honest, Van shows the king instead of money. Van asks for a permanent residency guarantee, ensuring he will never be transferred to another territory. The king agrees, provided Van works with the capital when needed, as the king prepares to leave. Screams erupt from the village. A dragon is approaching. Van quickly rallies the adventurers and defenses. With Panamera by his side, they look to the sky, ready for the next battle.